Welcome to Supreme Myths. My guest today is Professor Sherry Colb, the C. and S. Wong Professor of Law at Cornell. She graduated from Columbia College and Harvard Law School. She clerked for the Second Circuit and for Justice Blackmun on the United States Supreme Court. She has written too many articles and essays and blog posts to count. She's the author of several books about animal rights and sex equality, and she's the co-author of Beating Hearts about abortion and animal rights with Mike Dorf, who happens to be, by coincidence, her husband. Sherry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start with your book with Mike, Abortion and Animal Rights. Why don't you tell us what the connection is there, and why you use those two ideas together?
Sure. Well, so we were thinking about how people within the like what they call the pro-life movement and people within the animal rights movement both have they're advocating on behalf of some living being that whose status is controverted by society. So whether it's a zygote or an animal, so you have that in common. There's also a sense in which both cases involve confronting violence and what you might think of as mundane circumstances. So, for instance, abortion would feel like a regular medical procedure, and yet it's distinct for people within that movement because of its immorality. And similarly, eating animals, eating the things that are taken from the animals that would normally go to their offspring, are also sort of mundane. Like eating a piece, eating pasta doesn't feel very different from eating something with a meat sauce, but one of them involves something that our movement considers really immoral. The violence that happens is, if you want to call it violence within the abortion context, is hidden from view. So most people haven't seen an abortion or heard one described. And similarly, the violence that happens to the billions of animals that are killed for food and the basically the torture that happens before they die is all hidden from view. So a lot of people who don't live in a rural area go through their lives without ever seeing the animals who end up sliced up in their supermarkets. And so part of the objectives for both groups, I think, is to try to expose what is hidden, and that's something in common. And people on the other side for both groups invoke freedom. And the people within the group think of it as a freedom to slaughter and not a valuable freedom at all. So those ways in which the two movements have similar challenges and similar objectives in a way make the two seem like they go together. But of course, if you look around at the people who are against abortion, they are probably the least likely to favor animal rights of everybody in the population. And the reason for that is that there's an important distinction between the two groups. One group is fixated on human DNA. So if you have one cell and it's got human DNA, then that is somebody, a person, and it has to be, it's entitled to basically live inside the woman. And it's a sort of theory of human supremacy, really. And then the other group is very different because being human is neither necessary nor sufficient to have rights. Now, there are people who are both in both movements, and for them, being human would be sufficient, but it wouldn't be necessary. So you don't need human DNA. What matters is the capacity to experience suffering and to experience joy, basically to be able to have life go well or ill for you.
Right.
And that's not true of a zygote, but it is true of the animals that people consume.
So, yet you are both pro-choice, and we'll get to that certainly in a few minutes, and of course pro-animal rights. So
Yes.
how do you get there?
Well, the way we get there, as I said, we don't take the view that human DNA entitles someone to rights or something to rights.
Right.
So a zygote does not have rights in our view because it isn't capable of suffering or having things go well for it or ill for it any more than a plant. But for an animal, there is the capacity to suffer, and so our view is that the that it is wrong to inflict harm on animals and that
Good.
they have a right to be free of violence, and that when a human reaches a point of what we say like the point of sentience, which is when it's capable of experiencing pain or whatever, then at that point we would say abortion becomes a tough question then. And then,
Got it.
we need to think about it and think about what's involved and so on in a way that prior to that it isn't.
So let me. I am pro-choice too, all the way down. Though I do have different feelings about Roe and Casey than most progressives. But let me ask you this question: what do you say to somebody who says, and this is not my position, so I'm playing devil's advocate, but what do you say to somebody who says, well, you're defining kind of human as feeling pain or the ability to feel pain. Um, we define human as an organism that has human DNA, and we can talk about that for the next 1,000 years, but that's a value judgment that just, can't be right or wrong. It is simply a value judgment.
Well, I guess what I would say to that is that the notion that a cell, like a zygote, which is really the position, like I've started to refer to it as the prozygote
And I like that,
position.
Sherry. I like it a lot.
So, like that, the idea that that is a person or really anybody, like that it's no any different from like an amoeba. I think you need a religious kind of idea to go into that. I mean, I thought it was a great moment when, in the Dobbs oral argument, Justice Sotomayor said, "Well, what you're saying just now, that's a religious position."
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, you need that to take what is really a barely visible cell and say, that's a person just like my sister. That's just, so I think that, yes, it's true that drawing clear lines is tough in this area and there are going to be difficult gray areas. But I don't think there's really a gray area at the point of conception. I think the only people, I guess, who would call that a person and who would define that as a human being are people who are coming to it with a religious ideology. And then maybe some contrarian here and there would say, yeah, I think that's a person.
Sure. Okay, this is going to be a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it. So, am I committing? I'm afraid to ask this question. I really am terrified of this. Am I committing an immoral act, in your view, when I step on a roach?
Well, in my view, I don't really know like what insects can feel. I think that insects are so different from us that a lot of our intuitions don't really track with insects. For instance, sometimes they will run away from stuff. So it seems like they're avoiding pain.
Roaches definitely run away from me, Sherry,
Yeah,
all the
yeah,
time.
they definitely run away. But at the same time, they also will sometimes eat while someone else is eating them, which doesn't seem normal, like by any kind of animal calculus that we would encounter. So I don't know. And so I don't judge if you were worried that
I
I would
was.
judge that you step on a bug. We do have this thing that we try to use to get spiders out of the house without killing them. But yeah, I feel like it's also almost impossible to avoid killing insects because if you even, walk down the street,
Right.
you're going to end up just because of the scale of insect life. But yeah, I think that's one of those areas where you're going to have people debating each other about what to think about that. I think birds and mammals and fish and so on are very clearly in the sentient category and do things that that only makes sense if you posit that they're experiencing something.
Okay, and here's another ignorant question, and I did just for the audience. I did tell you before we started this that I am really ignorant about animal rights type issues, and we're going to get back to abortion and Dobbs in a minute. But on the animal rights issue, so the, we have to feed what is it, 7 billion people or something on this planet, whatever it is, and it's going
Yeah.
up. And can we feed everybody without using animals?
Yes, yes, we can. And in fact, I'm glad you asked that question because not only can we feed them, but we can feed them much more readily if we're not eating animals because it is very inefficient to feed an animal and then feed the animal to a person. You lose a lot of protein and calories along the way from doing it that way. Whereas if you use the same land to grow foods for humans, then you can feed many more humans. There's a real inefficiency to eating animals.
So this might interest you. My wife teaches at Emory Business School, and they have a case competition named after John Lewis. And this year, Andrew Young is doing a pre-recorded speech for that. And I was watching it last night. This is all happening tomorrow. And somebody asked Andrew Young, what he's 89 right now, kind of what his over the last 15 years, what he's been working on and stuff. And his answer was, we can barely feed 7 billion people. We're not going to be able to feed 9 billion people the way we're going, at least not easily. And he said I forget what it's called, but there's some kind of plant that grows all over the South, and I think other places. And he's been working on getting that plant to be able to be, to be used as food all over the world to some degree to replace animals. And I thought that was really
Oh,
interesting.
that's great. That's great. We had prior to the pandemic, we would participate in packing food to be sent overseas to areas where people are starving, and we didn't, we had nothing to do with selecting the food, but it was all vegan, and it was because it's so cheap to be able to provide rice and beans and whatever,
Right.
and it was like nutritionally complete so that they could take a child who was starving and bring them to health. And it was also really cheap.
He said this
So,
plant has like 50% of the protein you need for the day and a bunch of vitamins and minerals and good things. And if we could figure out a way to really grow it and have the land to grow it, it can really solve a lot of the world's food problems. I thought it was interesting.
that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so my understanding of your view then is we shouldn't kill, I'm finding the right word here, living creatures that can feel pain. Is that about right?
Pretty much not kill them or use them for their, breast milk and eggs also.
So it's not
Because
just a question of torture. In other words, if there was a humane way of using animals for food, you're against that too.
I would be. But in reality, when you're killing, 10 billion animals, just land animals alone, there's not going to be a humane way to do that. And so, I mean, part of why they have soundproof walls and all of the rest that people, the closest we come to seeing what goes on in a slaughterhouse is those trucks with the holes in it. And they're not always, I've seen them like stopped at a stop sign, and I look and there's a little calf looking at me, and it's just, so to me that's really, but that's all part of the slaughter industry. So if you're
Right.
taking,
So many years, in 1986, before I got married, I had a roommate who was a lawyer, and his law firm was representing Popeye's Chicken. And there was some tort suit against Popeyes that required him to go and see where Popeyes at the time got their chicken or how they processed it, or I'm not sure the right terminology is. And he was a huge fast food eater back in 1986. He came back that night as disturbed as I've ever seen him. He has not been back to and he hasn't had I don't know if he's a vegan. He's not had fast food chicken ever since. He was appalled at everything about it from beginning to end and how awful it was. Not just to the animals, but just the whole aesthetics of the whole thing was just.
no, it's awful. Like, this is the thing that's interesting, is that it's awful for animals, and it's also awful for people. Like,
Right.
they've done studies where they put a slaughterhouse into a town, and then they compare that town to the next door town without the slaughterhouse, and you see rates of domestic violence skyrocketing, you see alcoholism skyrocketing, all of these things, because it's really traumatic to take life from an animal who clearly doesn't want to die. Like, they resist, they move, the people then get angry at them from resisting, and then they remember how cruel they were, and they have a hard time with that.
So I did have a kind of moment about all this. I had a dog growing up, but wasn't particularly fond of it. And then I didn't have pets for most of my life. And my wife loves animals. When my
Mhm.
friends used to have dogs that would pass away and they would mourn for 6 months, I really never, I'm being honest, I just never understood it. I mean, I understood, a little bit of sadness. I never understood grief, grief's when you lose your brother or your mother, that kind of grief.
Right.
And then I met my wife, and she had two dogs, one of which was terrible, but the other dog was just one of the greatest dogs, just a great dog. And
Yeah.
when he passed, I really, when we put him down, I grieved. I felt real grief, and it wasn't
Yeah.
until that moment that I kind of got it, and it was kind of a come to it was a moment for me. And now, as people who follow me know, I have these two labs that are 85 pounds each. I'm going to be miserable when we eventually have to eventually put them down. And I don't think
Yeah.
that's irrelevant to this conversation.
No,
I sorry.
I think it's relevant
Yeah.
because animal rights is a human endeavor, right? Like, they
Right.
can't demand rights. I mean, occasionally the primates that can communicate really do. Like, they'll sort of sign "I'm sorry" when they're put in the cage, because they think maybe they've done something wrong.
Ugh,
But
that's heartbreaking. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
really is.
Yeah.
But it's our project, and when we feel attached, I think it makes it clear that attachment is not a uniquely human thing. Like, they're attached to us too, and
Right.
it's reciprocal.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want you to know that the little reading I've done over the last 48 hours has done a lot in how I think about these things.
Oh, cool.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on so badly was so I kind of have a reputation for speaking my mind at times when maybe I shouldn't, um, and being a little. I got in big trouble this week doing it because I spoke my mind on something that was not progressive, and I got killed by various liberals for doing it. Um, but your blog posts, I should have said you also blog at Dorf on Law. Um, your blog posts on the Dobbs oral argument were some of the best legal scholarship I've seen in a long time.
Oh,
I
thank you.
just loved them because they were raw, they were honest, and there was definitely legal content, but they weren't dripping with legalese in that in that kind of sense. So I really want to give you a chance, if you don't mind, to
Yeah.
rant about two or three of the things that bothered you the most about that argument.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, first of all. That's very kind. Uh, I think what bothered me the most is not what I expected to bother me the most. Like, I thought they would be very cagey and hide the ball and act as though, oh, they're just talking about this one 15-week limit. And I thought that was going to bother me because it's dishonest. And I was all set to be annoyed about that. But it kind of bothered me more that they were so open. Like, it's one of those jokes, like they say, you hate passive aggressive until you encounter aggressive aggressive.
That's great. I like that.
Yeah. And it was so, they were completely, like, upfront about their willingness to overrule Roe, their willingness to compare. Then this is, I guess, another thing that really bothered me. They're comparing Roe to Plessy against Ferguson, the separate but equal decision. They compared it to Bowers versus Hardwick, the sodomy decision, saying it was okay to criminalize same-sex sex. And then they compared it. They just continued to act as though this was some kind of liberatory moment for them to overrule Roe. Like, it's this ugly decision that's been, a sore on the arm of the democracy. And that was really frustrating and offensive to me, in part because all of them had acted like oh, it's a very important precedent. It's precedent upon precedent, and, all this stuff. And we kind of knew it was a lie, but the shamelessness with which they were prepared to just throw it overboard the first opportunity they got was really, really something. And it was really only the Chief Justice who wanted to talk about the 15-week ban. Like, it seemed almost like they were hearing different cases.
Right. Let me push back a little bit, okay?
Yeah.
Just because I do try to be somewhat neutral in these things at times. So Kavanaugh and Barrett and Gorsuch and Thomas and Alito for sure, and then I think Roberts to varying degrees. Let's not forget Roberts' wife ran Feminists for Life for a long time.
Yes.
That's not Feminists for Life. That's Feminists for Life. You know, um,
Right.
I doubt very much she's a feminist.
No.
They were raised. Their formative days in law school and then clerking, Roberts for Rehnquist, they were raised on this idea that Roe is an abomination, but not necessarily because abortion is somehow immoral or wrong, though they may think that, but because, as John Hart Ely unfortunately said, because I think he was really wrong, this isn't bad constitutional law. It's not constitutional law at all. And of course, he was a progressive. That statement has done so much damage over the years.
Yeah.
And just so I'm transparent here, I've on record for a long time as saying Roe and Casey are wrong. This issue should be returned to the states. But I wrote a piece for Mike, and I've said also, but Roe is no different than any other constitutional law case. It's no less or more, legal than any other case. It's just that I think politically it was a mistake. But anyway, so they were raised on that, and that was their lifeblood. That's the Federalist Society 1988 lifeblood. And so now they finally have the power to do it, and they're kind of thinking this is something that should have been done a long time ago. We got within one vote in Casey, and we thought we had Casey because Kennedy voted to overturn Roe in '89 and then changed his mind. Full disclosure, of course, your husband clerked for Casey Justice Kennedy that term. But this is their moment. Like, they've been fighting this for 3 decades in their heads, and now they can finally do it. That's how they're thinking, I think.
I know. I agree that that's how they're thinking of it, and I understand that. But first, they had done this whole song and dance about their respect for precedent and their understanding that Roe is precedent.
Right.
So I guess the sense that they felt it was kind of like they didn't care anymore about seeming to have integrity because now they have the power. So that was the leap that was kind of troubling, although obviously either way they're going to overrule it. So in a way it doesn't matter. But and then also Barrett saying that, can't you just leave the baby at a fire station?
God, I hated that. I'm with you on that one.
I mean, it's like she's completely, first of all, that doesn't really do anything to address the burdens of pregnancy and what it takes from a woman, a person who's pregnant. And also, if somebody has to have the baby, then they're going to be bonding to the baby. So it's not so simple to just leave them off.
Of course.
I mean, one of the arguments, just to bring back the animal rights thing, one of the arguments against dairy, and what sometimes when people come and they say to me, okay, I want to give up something, what should I give up first? And I usually just say dairy, because dairy is such a cruel business, because first they impregnate this cow, and then she loves this baby more than anything, and they drag them away, and there are all these videos of the cow like trying so hard and to get to their babies. They'll chase like wheelbarrows trying to get to their babies, and that's a normal mammal reaction to giving birth, is that you fall in love with the baby. And that's true for somebody who's, expected to leave the baby at the fire station too.
Right.
So the whole framework ignores the reality of pregnancy and birth and the feelings that go with that.
I thought that Barrett's comments legally were atrocious, doctrinally were stupid, and in a way, I was kind of glad she made them, because it just fortifies all of my work about the Supreme Court, which is
Yeah.
that it all comes down to values and experiences. All of it comes down to values and experiences. And she's adopted 2 children, and good for her. I'm glad she did. And in her world, I'm sure that adoption is a serious alternative to childbirth and blah blah blah. It has nothing to do with the
Right.
burden women have when it comes to not being able to terminate their pregnancies. And it's just
Yeah.
it
No,
was
I think
really
that's right.
it was an insane moment. You wrote. I also want you to rant a little bit because I do this all the time, but people get tired of me ranting about it, so I want somebody else to rant about it. Um, Kavanaugh's use of "it's not in the Constitution." The word abortion is not in the
Yeah.
Constitution. I
Yeah.
literally got physically sick when I was listening to that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And then he had that line, which I'm sure he practiced for the Mirror, saying that, wait, so you're not asking us to prohibit abortion.
Right,
So the Constitution is neutral. It's
right,
not pro life or pro choice.
right.
And this kind of like, it's almost like he thinks everybody in the country is stupid because
He might
I
think that
can't.
though.
He might, because he busted his ass at Yale, so not everybody is
Right.
that.
You mean
But
he drank a lot of beer? Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Apparently, he was ranked as the biggest drinker there at the
Nice,
time,
nice. Um,
which is something.
But let's talk about his point seriously for a minute. So he's
Yeah, yeah.
saying the word abortion is not in the Constitution, therefore somehow it's wrong for the court to protect it, and now you go.
Okay, so that's ridiculous. There are a lot of words that are not in the Constitution, or else we wouldn't have a whole lot of case law interpreting the Constitution. It seems to me that what we do have in the Constitution, we have the Third Amendment, that you can't be quartering troops in someone's home, and it does seem to suggest that, well, you shouldn't be able to quarter anyone in their body either. Um, and then there's the Fourth Amendment, which people have a right to be secure from unreasonable search and seizure in their person. And this seems to me like a seizure, to be taking women and saying, you must carry this, you must create a person in your body. And certainly if we look at other kinds of rights and the rights that the Supreme Court has identified, this fits well within that. So this is not any kind of a departure. One of the things that the argument got me thinking is that I used to think there are 2 issues in abortion. One is the status of the embryo or whatever, and the other is the imposition on women. But after the oral argument, I just started thinking that those 2 things are actually, they go together, because if you think that the embryo is already a child, then that really alters what you think a pregnancy is. You're just kind of babysitting for a child that's already been created. Whereas what women are really asked to do is to take raw materials and turn them into a baby. And that act of creation has to be consensual. So I feel like the two issues are really one issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's well said. I agree with all that. I'm going to rant for a second then.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court has made up so many rights and limits over the years that Kavanaugh would agree with. We can. And this is okay. This is my audience is a mix of lawyers, law professors, and lay people. For the lay people, I apologize. I'm going to go through this very quickly. He's for an anti-commandeering principle that doesn't exist in the text, and I think is ahistorical. He is for sovereign immunity by states against citizens who sue them under federal law. Who sue their own states. That's not in the Constitution anywhere. I know he would say that parents have the right to raise their children as they see fit. There's a Supreme Court case on that. That's nowhere. I know he agrees with the idea that we all have a right, if we're competent, to refuse unwanted medical treatment. That's not in the Constitution. And that one is the closest, right? So I have the right to tell, if I'm dying, as long as I'm, or not, I have the right, as long as I'm competent, to say to a doctor, you can't touch me.
Right, exactly.
But a woman doesn't have the right to control her own body? I mean, what? Because it's not in the Constitution? I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. And it's also, there's an irony to it wasn't a constitutional argument, but still the sense that there's this the sacrosanct right not to be vaccinated.
Right.
But
Right.
not any right not to be pregnant.
Right.
And as though those two are comparably
Right. Exactly.
burdensome.
Right. I also want to say one more thing about Kavanaugh. Just I wasn't planning on saying this, but I have to get off my chest. And I can't. This is just my reaction to him. I'm not saying I have data or facts or whatever. But
Right.
he, when he brings his girls' softball team to the conference or whatever it was, to the basketball team, to the girls' to his confirmation hearing, and he
Yeah.
keeps stressing over and over again how much he appreciates and respects women, and he's hired more female law clerks than anybody, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. All of that to me is a huge cover for unconscionable misogyny. Um,
Yes.
do you
Absolutely.
agree with that?
I do agree with that. I
Yeah.
think that I mean, all you need to do is look at his yearbook from Georgetown Prep, and he clearly was a misogynist, and he lied about it when, like, if he had said, I was kind of a creep
Right.
as a high school student, then I think people might have forgiven him. But when somebody is completely lying about what they were like, then that suggests that they're still like that now.
So
You know, that
my shorthand way of saying that is anybody who's, and this is old cliche, anybody who says they love all women loves no women, and that's where he is.
yeah, yeah,
That's where he
yeah.
is.
And I think that's right. Yeah, the law clerk thing was such a show. You know.
Yeah. So is it your prediction they're going to actually, because you'd be a minority, you're definitely a minority in the minority view on this if it is. Is it your
Yeah.
prediction they're going to flatly overturn Roe and Casey in June?
Well, I think that that was their plan on the day of the Dobbs oral argument.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the Chief Justice is able to reach them and say, this would look bad, because he's really concerned about what the court looks like.
Yeah.
And he might be able to somehow get them, I don't think he'll get Alito or Thomas.
No.
But to just say that to uphold this law and say nothing else. So I think it may be a fractured thing, but I think there were 5 votes to overturn it on that day, and any change would have been a negotiation.
Interesting. Yesterday, someone I respect said to me, again, predicting always is a dangerous business, but is predicting a 3-3-3. with three saying 15 weeks is not an undue burden, three
Right.
wanting to overturn Alito, Thomas, and one of the other, and then Barrett wanting to overturn Roe altogether.
And I think Gorsuch it'll be 4 at least.
I don't know about Gorsuch. See, I think he follows the headlines more than he might let on. But yeah, maybe. Who knows? Whatever it's going to be painful and bad. I think is.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I'm thinking about the Chief Justice and thinking that if he couldn't convince Gorsuch to wear a mask,
Right.
then he may not be able to convince him to do anything
Well,
else.
so I've been very vocal in the last couple of days. Um, I think I think sometimes apples fall very far from the tree. I think I think if my mom has passed away, but if you met her and met me,
I'm sorry.
you'd see some very big differences. But his mother was awful, and she was terrible, and she ran the EPA into the ground and had to resign in disgrace under Ronald Reagan. And I think he's awful and terrible in the same way. So I'm not
Yeah,
expecting a lot. I want to shift. We're running out of time. I want to shift gears to something because we were talking about women and Kavanaugh. So I want to talk about
yeah,
this. You wrote a piece, a fabulously interesting piece about gun fantasies and domestic
yeah.
violence. Could you summarize that piece? Because I thought that was just so interesting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So what I said in that piece is that normally we talk about when we talk about gun violence, we talk about the either we look at the Second Amendment and the language and what we think it means and the right to bear arms, or we talk about how frequent gun violence is when you have guns or don't. But I think what really can sometimes drive the law in this area is what people have on their mind as the story, the narrative of what happens with guns. And part of the narrative is about domestic violence, and that when women are victimized, they can use a gun to protect themselves. And that, the facts don't bear this out. And it's hard to compete with a charismatic narrative,
Mm-hmm.
but the facts don't bear this out at all, because in fact, normally when you have an abusive relationship, the abuser is stronger than the victim. The abuser is very controlling of the victim's time and possessions, and so it would be difficult for a victim even to be able to have a gun and hide it in a place where her batterer wouldn't get to it. And so the reality of how these things work and doesn't bear out the notion that she can protect herself with a gun. And I think there are a lot of these sorts of narratives that people have about how things work. Like they, imagine, oh, this, like when people think of a dairy farm, they think, oh, all the cows are happy and, we milk the cow. And most people don't even realize that the reason they're lactating is because they had a baby, like
Right.
humans too, like
Right.
that, but, and so I think that whenever you run into a narrative like that, it's an uphill battle. But I do think part of the Second Amendment narrative is that that you can equalize the power disparity between men and women with the gun, and so the gun it's like a feminist
Right.
artifact, and it doesn't work that way in
Right.
reality at all.
First of all, I love the word fantasy in that piece because I think we have so many. America has so many fantasies. I just did a podcast 2 hours ago talking about the American public's fantasies about federal judges and how bizarre they are. So I love that word. I don't know my intuition is, if we had the data, maybe you do, I don't know, that even if in the unlikely scenario where a woman could use a gun effectively against a domestic abuser, I am guessing those women likely will get prosecuted.
Yes, and in fact, at least as of 1989, I don't know if they've studied it since then.
Right.
I apologize for how long ago that was, but the women who were getting the most lengthy sentences were the ones who killed their batterers.
Right. Right.
And the reason for it was because they typically would do it while he was asleep rather than in the middle of an attack.
Right.
But the reality is that if you're in the middle of an attack, that's just not. It's too late.
It's too late. Right. Of course. But even in the middle of an attack, I'm guessing there'll be.
If they. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's actually true. There was. Yeah. I heard about a case where this woman, her husband had a gun, and he said to her, "Okay, our kids are not going to have parents. First you, then me." And she grabbed the gun and shot him, and she ended up in prison.
Right.
And
right.
it's like, what more clear-cut case could you have?
And again, the word fantasy is in the title of your piece. I'll tell you what it made me think of. Because I think, now getting outside of the real world harm of domestic abuse and how serious a problem that is and how guns are not going to solve that problem, no chance. Everything about the Second Amendment is a fantasy. Everything.
Yeah.
But it occurred to me, amazingly, that word is even too weak.
It's a delusion.
No, that word's too weak. There's actually a better word. And it was used by somebody who wouldn't expect. This is, the lawyers listening to this will know this, but Chief Justice Warren Burger, a gun-toting Republican from Minnesota, who clearly liked his gun, who was conservative and liked his guns, Chief Justice of the United States, when the NRA shifted from an organization that was for gun regulation and very concerned about gun safety to an organization that did all the work for the gun lobby and gun, for profits. When they made that shift, and then some law professors started getting involved and saying maybe there is a real Second Amendment right here, Berger called it a fraud.
Wow.
And I think that's actually the exact right word, a fraud on the American people.
It really is, and it's so dangerous. Like now, it's going to be starting in June, I guess. New York City subway, people are going to be packing heat.
Right.
And this is not a good thing. And Justice Alito, I don't want to leave him out of our festival. He was, talking about the poor janitor who gets out of work and has to get on the subway, and he'd feel so much better if he had a weapon. And there was some labor leader who made a point of calling out Alito, and it's like, don't even have our name in your mouth.
Right.
Really just
Right.
You have
Right.
this is bogus. Like you didn't care about us when it was about having a right to collect dues or any of the things that concern working people.
Right. And then going full circle, of course, with Kavanaugh, who wrote the most gun friendly opinion I've ever read in my life on the D.C. Circuit in
Oh
dissent,
yeah.
where he said basically you're allowed to have as many guns as there's no limit on the states cannot limit how many guns you have 1,000 guns, 1,000,000 guns. There's
It's amazing. And of course if we were talking about the courthouse, that's the one place
right,
where you can
right.
limit them.
And what I was going to say was what's what we both agree that the Supreme Court doesn't care about text anyway consistently, and that there are all kinds of
No.
rights not in the text. But to the extent one cares about text, he is in favor of deleting a well-regulated militia from the text of the
Yeah.
Second Amendment, which is worse
Yeah.
than making stuff up. It's
Yeah, right.
all right.
Leaving
We have
stuff.
like 5 more minutes, so I want to close this out by saying something about Justice Blackmun and getting your reaction to it because
Sure.
you cook for him. Um,
Yeah.
I tell my students all the time, of all the things that's wrong with life tenure, and there are so many things wrong with life tenure, the worst is it eventually breeds a lack of humility that almost any human being will feel if they have enormous power for life. And then I say, but there are exceptions. Every now and then you come up with exceptions. And what I love about Justice Blackmun, leaving aside whether I agree with his results or not, what I loved about him from his written opinions is that he always seemed to me to be reasonably modest and humble. And so again for the lawyers and law professors around, when he joins the opinion in Ussery that said that Congress can't tell the states what to do even under the Commerce Clause, and he did it very modestly and tentatively, and then he changed his mind in Garcia. He didn't play lawyers' games and try to make distinctions, and so, he just literally changed his mind.
Yes.
And I think changing, and so my friend, it's my podcast, and once a podcast, I have to mention Judge Posner. My friend Judge Posner changed his mind on like his entire career work after the 2007 economic crash, and he changed his mind all the time because he liked to learn. And there are so few Supreme Court judges like that. Am I getting Blackmun right? I hope I am.
Yes, you are. He was very humble. He actually, it was kind of funny. We had breakfast with him every day, and that was sort of our chance to talk with him because everything else during the day was done by memo. But we would sit at breakfast and whatever, if somebody had a joke or something. And that was when we would bring family members to meet him. So I brought my then 15-year-old niece, and she was working for the school paper. So she was going to get a scoop by like interviewing him. So after breakfast, he said to me, "Can you be in the room too? Because I'm a little nervous about the interview." It was so funny. It was like, you're nervous to talk to a child. But he, and he would say, "This is very tough." Like when there was a tough issue, he would say, this is keeping me up there. He never drank his own Kool-Aid, I guess.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, by the way, I think Souter was like that too.
And, I liked Souter a lot.
And Lord, it's not because of their politics. This is not a political statement.
No, just as people.
Just as people. That's right. And we need so much more of that these days. All right, I'm sorry. I have to call it there. Thank you so much for being on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
You're very welcome.
And I want people to come away from this podcast. The name of the book is Beating Hearts: Abortion and Animal Rights. What is the reason I want to really go full circle? You did Boston University or Boston University, I think, did a symposium on the book, and you and Mike wrote a response to the people who wrote articles. And the very last sentences of your response was how this book is making these ideas and suggestions somewhat tentatively, and that these are hard issues and hard questions and emotional questions, and you're really trying to ask more questions and get to better answers, not taking hard line, firm legal positions. I thought that was wonderful. I think that's exactly how law professors should act. That's why I love you and Mike. And I think it's how judges should act. And it's why I like Blackman and Souter. And you're really a credit to our profession for that. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I really
Well,
appreciate it.
I really mean it. Thank you so much. And I hope people buy your book. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. Take care.